The Man Next to You. Original stories of ordinary people in extraordinary hours. The ones history forgets to name. Season 3, The Hot Land. Episode 2, The Waterline. The reef was the meanest piece of water in the world, and Corporal Gil Ostrander crossed it 26 times that first day, and he counted every one. He counted because counting was the only thing that kept the fear in a box. Crossing number 1 had nearly killed him, and crossing number 26 would have the exact same chance of killing him as the first, because the reef did not learn and did not tire and did not care how many times you had already made it. And a man could lose his mind thinking that way, so Ostrander didn't think that way. He thought, this is crossing number 14. He thought about the number, and the number had no fear in it, and so he could drive. The thing he drove was an amtrac, a tracked amphibious tractor, a steel boat that thought it was a tank, that crawled on its tracks across the coral shelf the Higgins boats couldn't pass. He had named her Daisy June, after nobody in particular, just a name that sounded like a place where nothing was on fire. And he had painted it small on the inside where only he could see it. Daisy June carried 20 men or a load of ammunition or a stack of wounded, and her job, and Ostrander's job, was the simplest and most necessary job on the whole island, to keep the door open from the water side, because the men on the beach could not live on what they carried in. They needed more bullets, more grenades, and most of all, though nobody had understood it yet that first morning, more water, and the wounded could not stay. There was nowhere on that beach for a wounded man to be. So it all came down to the tractors crawling back and forth across the killing reef, in and out, the artery of the whole landing, and if the artery closed, the landing died. Crossing 14, Ostrander said aloud to Daisy June, to himself, and put her nose down off the line of departure and into it. The reef under him was the color of a bruise through the clear water, and the water was full of things now that hadn't been there at dawn. Wrecked tractors, some of them his friends, sitting canted and burning on the coral, and other things in the water he had taught himself in the last 4 hours not to look at directly. The fire came from the high ground, the same ridge that lorded over the beach, flat trajectory stuff that skipped off the water in white feathers, and mortars that walked across the reef in lines exactly as if a man up there were drawing them with a ruler, which a man up there was. You could not go fast. That was the horror of the amtrac, the thing that separated the tractormen from everyone else's idea of them. People thought of a charge, speed, a thing flashing across the danger. Daisy June crawled. She climbed onto the reef and ground across it at the pace of a man walking with a limp, fully exposed, broadside to the guns for whole minutes at a stretch. And there was not one thing Ostrander could do about any of it but hold his course in his speed and trust the number. His bowgunner, a kid named Pelkey, was hunched down behind the .30 caliber up front and not firing because there was nothing to fire at. The men killing them were inside a mountain, and that was its own particular cruelty, the same one the truck drivers and the slick pilots of other wars would know, that you took the fire and could not give it back. You just drove. Almost across, Pelkey. Almost to the sand. Keep your head down and count with me. 14. We're on 14. I hate 14, Pelkey said into the steel. Everybody hates 14. 14's almost done. Here comes the sand. He came in on a stretch of beach where a rifle squad had gotten itself off the open and dug into the lip, and a big sergeant was up and waving him into a spot, the way the good ones did, standing up in the fire, making himself a target so the tractor would know where to land, because a tractor coming in blind was worse for everyone. Ostrander put Daisy June in where the sergeant waved and dropped the load he had brought, cans of rifle ammunition, cases of grenades, and on top, almost as an afterthought that morning, that nobody yet knew would become the most precious cargo on the island, a few cans of water. Marines swarmed the tractor to drag the supplies clear, fast, because a tractor sitting still on the sand was the best target on the beach, and everybody knew it. And then they brought him the wounded. That was the run that Ostrander would remember out of all 26, though at the time it was just crossing 14. Just another load. They came stumbling and crawling and being carried down to Daisy June, and 3, 4, then more than he'd brought supplies for. And the big sergeant was directing it. And there was a young Marine, a boy Italy, helping to lift a man with a ruined leg up over the side, a man who was gray and slick with shock. And the boy would not let go of him even when the others had him, kept holding the man's hand and saying something to him, and the sergeant had to put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's on the tractor, son. He's going. You did your part. Let him go now." The boy let go. The wounded man, somebody called him Dewey. "Hang on, Dewey, you lucky dog. You're going home." Looked up at Ostrander from the steel floor of the tractor with eyes that weren't all the way there. And Ostrander leaned down over his controls and said the thing he said to all of them. The only thing there was to say. "I got you. You're on a Daisy June now. She's never lost a soul she got off the sand." Which was a lie, or at least a thing he couldn't possibly know. But it was the right lie, the lie that was a kind of medicine. "You just hold on across the reef, and we'll have you on a ship with clean sheets and a pretty nurse before you know it." The sergeant slapped the side of the tractor twice, the signal, loaded, go, and looked at Ostrander for 1 second across all the noise. A look that passed something between them that neither would ever say out loud. And Ostrander never learned the sergeant's name, and the sergeant never learned his. And that was the shape of the whole war. "Crossing 15, Ostrander said, and backed Daisy June off the sand and turned her wallowing bulk back toward the reef and the guns, the wrong way. The way that was all uphill, loaded now with the broken instead of the whole. Going back was worse, and not for the reason you'd think. It was worse because of the cargo. Going in, you carried things, and things don't make sound. Coming out, you carried men, and the men who could make sound did, and the ones who couldn't were worse than the ones who could. Ostrander drove crossing 15 across the reef under the same fire as crossing 14, and behind him in the well of the tractor, the boy named Dewey and the others bled and called out, and one of them, very quietly and steadily, the whole way across, said a name that wasn't Ostrander's. A woman's name, over and over, the way you'd say a prayer, and Ostrander drove and did not let himself listen to the individual words, because if he listened to the words, he would not be able to drive, and driving was the only thing he had to give them. A mortar dropped close off the port side and threw a wall of warm water across the open tractor, and one of the wounded screamed, and Pelkey said, oh God, and Ostrander said, in the flat, low voice he'd found somewhere in himself that morning and would use for the rest of his life, we're okay back there. That one missed. They all miss, but the last one in that wasn't the last one. Hold on, number 15, almost to the ship. He got them to the transfer point off the reef where the small boats could take them, and hands reached up and lifted the wounded out of Daisy June and away toward the hospital ships. Dewey going up and over and gone, out of Ostrander's story forever. And Ostrander would never know. You almost never knew. Whether the leg was saved or the man was saved or any of it, whether crossing 15 had been worth the terror of it. You handed them up into other hands and you turned around. That was the job. You had to learn to let the not knowing be a kind of peace instead of a wound, or it would eat you alive. And some of the tractor men learned that, and some of them never did. Crossing 16, Ostrander said, and turned Daisy June back toward the island. By the middle of the afternoon, the water had become the thing. He felt it in himself first. The headache like a spike, the thick tongue, the strange floating clumsiness in his hands on the controls. And he understood dimly through his own thirst what was happening on the beach and up on that ridge where the riflemen were. The heat was past anything he'd ever felt. The steel of Daisy June, too hot to touch with a bare hand, and there was no water. Or there was water, but it had come ashore in old fuel drums that hadn't been cleaned, and it came out brown and stinking of diesel and made men vomit, which only dried them out worse. Ostrander had seen Marines on the beach on their hands and knees, not hit, just down, knocked flat by the heat and the thirst as surely as by a bullet. So the cargo changed. By afternoon, the most wanted thing in Daisy June's well was not ammunition. It was water, real water in clean cans, and Ostrander ran it in every crossing he could, and he watched what it meant when he brought it. He watched men come down off that lip of sand to the tractor with their lips cracked black and their eyes gone strange, and put their faces to a can of clean water, and he watched something come back into them, some flicker of the person that the heat had been pressing out, and Ostrander understood then, with the simple clarity the thirst gave everything, that this dumb errand, this water taxi, this crawling back and forth across a reef that was trying to kill him, that this was the most important thing he would ever do in his life, and that nobody would ever write it down. "Crossing 20, he told Pelkey. "We're on 20. You still with me?" "I'm dreaming about a Coca-Cola, Gil," Pelkey said, faint. "A cold one, with the ice on the outside of the bottle. I can see it." "Hold that thought. Hold it the whole way across. Here comes the reef." The last crossing of the day, number 26, though Ostrander didn't know it would be the last, you never knew which was the last, came at dusk, and the island let the dark come down the way it did, fast and total, and the dark changed the reef. In the dark, you couldn't see the wrecks anymore, or the things in the water, and that was a mercy, but you also couldn't see the coral heads that would hang a tractor up and leave it sitting helpless, and that was not. Ostrander ran crossing 26 by feel and by the burning landmarks ashore. Daisy June loaded with water and a relief squad going in, and somewhere in the middle of the reef, in the pitch dark, she lurched and ground and stopped, hung up on a coral head, helpless, broadside, the worst possible thing. For a moment, Ostrander felt the fear come all the way up out of its box. Stuck on the reef in the dark with a full load, the one thing every tractor man dreaded, the way the truck drivers dreaded a stall in the kill zone, the way every man in every war dreaded the moment the machine that was keeping him alive stopped moving. "You are never so safe as when you are moving," somebody had told him once, an old chief in another life. "Never so vulnerable as when you are still." And here he was, still on the reef, in the dark. He did not fall apart. He found out in that moment the thing about himself he'd needed his whole life to know and had not been able to find at home, that when the worst came and there was nothing to do but work the problem, he could work the problem. He rocked her, forward and back on the tracks, gunning and reversing, the way you'd rock a car out of mud, talking the whole time, low, to Daisy June and to Pelkey and to the relief squad gone silent in the well. "Come on, girl, come on. You've crossed this reef 25 times today. You don't quit on 26, come on." And the tracks bit and caught in them, and Daisy June dragged herself up off the coral head and lurched forward and was moving again. And the relief in the well of her came out of all of them at once in a sound that wasn't a cheer, too tired for a cheer, just a long, low breath of men who had felt the door start to close and felt it swing open again. He put the relief squad and the water on the beach in the dark, and the big sergeant wasn't there this time, or Ostrander couldn't find him in the dark, and he didn't get to land on that same stretch. And so he never did learn whether the wounded man named Dewey had made it, or whether the boy who wouldn't let go of his hand was still alive up there on the lip somewhere in the dark. He just dropped his load and backed off the sand. "Crossing 27, he started to say. And then the word came down the line and across the water, "Secure the reef runs till dawn. Too dark, hold what you got." And he realized there wasn't going to be a 27 tonight. He took Daisy June out to the transport area and shut her down and sat in the sudden, enormous quiet, his hands shaking now that they were allowed to, his whole body one cramp of thirst and terror and the strange floating exhaustion of a day that had no shape he could hold. Pelkey passed him a can of water, real water, clean, that they'd held back one can of for themselves. And Ostrander drank, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted or ever would. And he thought of the men up on that ridge in the dark who didn't have it. And he stopped after 2 swallows and capped it and put it down. "That's enough," he said. "We run it into them tomorrow. They need it worse than us. We can wait for the ship's water." Pelkey looked at the capped can and didn't argue, and that was its own small act, the kind nobody writes down. Somewhere out in the dark island, the dark ridge was waking up. the snipers and the infiltrators and the flares, and a sound carried thin across the water from the beach, a sound Ostrander would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life without ever having been the one to answer it. Corpsman, Corpsman up. And he could do nothing about it from out here on the Blackwater, and that was the hardest part. That was always the hardest part, the not being able to reach them. Tomorrow there would be a crossing 27 and a 40th and a 60th, days of it, weeks of it, the reef every time exactly as deadly as the first time, and Ostrander crossing it anyway because the men on the far side could not live without what Daisy June carried. He would get older if he was lucky, the way the lucky do, and he would go home and almost never speak of it. And people would say, "Oh, you drove a boat," and he would let them, because there were no words for the reef that they would understand. But on the bad nights, what would come back to him would not be the fire or the wrecks or the things in the water. It would be a wounded man named Dewey looking up at him from the steel floor, and a boy on the beach who wouldn't let go of a hand, and a big sergeant he never met slapping the side of the tractor twice and giving him a look that said, "Thank you. I'll never know your name. Take care of them." And Ostrander, drinking clean water in the dark with another long day of the reef ahead of him, would whisper it back across all the years to the man he never met. "I tried to. I crossed it 26 times. I tried to take care of them." And he had, and nobody wrote it down. And it was the most important thing he ever did. You've been listening to The Man Next to You. These people are fictional. What they carried was not. If this story stayed with you, leave it where someone else might find it, and come back next week for the next one. Until then, take care of the man next to you.